Okay, hello, my name is Brad Bell. I am the William J. Conady Professor of Strategic Human Resources here in the ILR School at Cornell. I also serve as the Academic Director of the Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Spring 2021 partner meeting, which will be focusing on driving and evolving the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. While each fall we always hold a fall partner meeting, this is the first time in some time that we've actually held a spring partner meeting. However, over the last several months, we've been working on an extensive stream of research and projects focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, really designed to better understand how companies have been evolving their DE&I agendas given the events over the past year. We really felt like a spring meeting was the best opportunity to come together, reflect on what we've learned, and share out some of the insights. This work was really stimulated in part by a survey that we did at the end of last year, asking HR leaders in our CAHRS partner companies what issues were top of mind for them as they look forward to 2021. DE&I was one of the most commonly mentioned themes that showed up in that survey, which really wasn't surprising given the attention that's been focused on racial and social justice over the past year. What was interesting, however, was what these HR leaders talked about as prioritizing around DE&I. In part, they were certainly focused on building greater capability in this space so as to support employees and managers, but they were also focused on not just doing more, but also doing things differently. They were engaged in efforts in particular to really figure out how to adjust their efforts in the DE&I arena to have a bigger impact. For example, a number of companies indicated that they're striving to do a better job of measuring exactly what's working well and maybe not working so well, so as to really figure out where to focus their investments to have the greatest impact. They also reported plans to move beyond just improving representation to really trying to create kind of a true sense of inclusion and belonging in their organizations. Overall, what became clear from the survey was that companies are not just seeking to amplify, but also to evolve their DE&I agendas. So to better understand exactly how they're doing this, CAHRS launched an intensive research project led by two of our research assistants, and also conducted a series of 4 working groups that focused on a range of topics, from how companies are facilitating constructive DE&I conversations in the workplace, to how they're trying to build inclusive DE&I cultures, as well as how they're measuring and using analytics to assess the impact of their different initiatives. Over the next couple hours, our CAHRS faculty and research assistants will be sharing out a number of different insights that have emerged from this work. In addition, we're really excited to be able to shine the spotlight on 2 of our CAHRS partner companies and highlight some of the innovative work that they're doing in this area. In particular, we have Yolanda Friend from Accenture and Sarah Bowen from Boeing, who will be talking about some of the innovative DE&I practices that they've been working on in their organizations. We really want today's sessions to be interactive, so we've built in time for Q&A after each of the different presentations. So I would encourage you as we go throughout today's program, please submit your questions as you have them. We'll be compiling them and then be using them to facilitate some discussion following each of the different segments. I would also encourage you to use the chat function throughout today's session to share your own thoughts, reactions, and experiences, and to engage in dialogue with the other attendees. So we have a lot to cover today, so let's jump right in. First up, we have a presentation from 2 of our master's students, Dhara Puvar and Ethan Call, who will be sharing the results of a semester-long research project that they've conducted, really focusing on the evolution of DE&I practices. So a little bit about Dhara and Ethan. Dhara is a second-year Mylar student concentrating in human resources and organizations. She has her bachelor's degree in psychology from Loyola University Chicago. Prior to the Mylar program, Dhara served as executive director of an immigrant justice nonprofit and also worked in global talent acquisition at the UN, both of which really contributed to her interest in DE&I. Last summer, Dhara interned at Cigna in their compensation consulting team and at Deloitte as a summer associate. She will be returning to Deloitte full-time this summer as a consultant in their human capital practice. Ethan is also a second-year Mylar focused on human resources and organizations. He has his bachelor's degree in industrial and organizational psychology from Brigham Young University, Idaho. Prior to the Mylar program, he worked as an HR consultant and executive assistant for a small business in his home state of Washington. Last summer, Ethan interned at Boeing on their people analytics and workforce intelligence team, where he saw firsthand how HR and DE&I can use data to make the workplace better and more equitable. After graduation this semester, Ethan will be returning to Boeing with a position in their HR Career Foundations program. Both Dhara and Ethan have been working as research assistants for CAHRS this entire semester, working hard on this project, talking to many companies, as you'll see. And I think you'll find that they really were able to extract some great insights, not only in terms of how DE&I agendas have evolved over the past year, but also where this area might be heading in the future. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dhara and Ethan.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you everyone for taking the time to be here today. Before we begin, Ethan and I would just like to thank the entire CAHRS team, especially Beth Flynn Ferry and Brad, for their tremendous support this semester as we embarked on this research. And we would like to extend an additional thanks to all of the companies who participated in our study. Ethan and I valued your insight and appreciated your sincerity, and we genuinely enjoyed the discussions that we had and are eager to share our findings on the evolution of DE&I with you all today. So we wanted to begin with a bit of a reflection on this last year, which has definitely been a trying time for our world. The nation was just beginning to come to terms with the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic when it witnessed the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and far too many others. Yesterday, May 25th, actually marks the one-year anniversary of George Floyd's death and America's re-reckoning with racism and anti-Blackness. The United States has a long storied history of racial injustice, but the worldwide protests and demonstrations of last summer in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement captured everyone's attention in a way that felt different. Corporations in particular began to re-examine their place in the call for social justice and racial equity, and many companies, CAHRS partners included, met that call and have taken a more insightful and intentional look at diversity, equity, and inclusion within themselves over the last year. So as Ethan and I began looking at potential research topics this past January, we talked about all of the ways that HR and life more broadly has changed over the last 12 months. And we decided that we had this incredible opportunity to study how this year and the events of summer 2020 in particular have impacted DEI in the workplace and beyond. So that was the impetus for our research and what we set out to study. So in this effort over the past 4 months, we've been able to engage with 39 leaders in this space, from chief diversity officers to heads of talent across 32 CAHRS partner companies to gain insight on their DE&I practices. Through interviews and surveys, we gathered both qualitative and quantitative data and used analysis and techniques like affinity diagramming to uncover some really interesting findings. Our sample size spanned across industries and maturity in the DEI space. And one thing that Ethan and I learned this semester was that DEI is highly contextual. For example, company size in our sample ranged from 3,800 to over 500,000. And that's a factor that will undeniably change a way that DEI is structured, resourced, and scaled within an organization. But with this in mind, many of the impacts and trends that we'll be sharing with you today are those that ring true for companies despite their differences in size, industry, or DEI maturity. We found that many organizations are navigating the same challenges, priorities, and opportunities as their peers. So now that we've given you an overview of the intentions and methodology behind our research, we'd like to point to the objectives that guided our project from start to finish. So we had 3 primary research questions, and in terms of today's agenda, the trends and findings we'll share with you today will follow these objectives. So first, we wanted to understand better and more clearly how exactly the events of summer 2020 shifted the DEI landscape. Next, we wanted to uncover the priorities and challenges that came from this shift and identify what the key opportunities were for HR to make an impact in this space. And third, we wanted to help companies look towards the next evolution of DEI. And we've mapped out some questions for consideration as organizations look to sustain and innovate on this work long-term.
So as Dhara mentioned, our first research objective was kind of getting a sense for how the events of summer 2020 impacted DE&I, especially over the last 12 months. So as we looked at the interview data and the surveys that we received from the participating companies, what we saw was that there were 2 high-level impacts when it came to DE&I. So the first high-level impact was that companies' appetite for DE&I had increased because of the events of summer 2020. And what we mean by appetite here is that the amount of pull coming from the organization to the DE&I function had really increased. And along those same lines, the other high-level impact was that the speed at which companies were moving had also increased. So we saw that many companies were already doing a lot in the DE&I space before summer 2020, but the speed at which they were moving was now evolving and increasing. And these 2 high-level impacts really manifested themselves in 6 key shifts that we saw as we talked with these companies. So the first key shift was attention and prioritization of DEI. So we saw an increase here, specifically from our survey data. We saw that 70% of companies agreed that DE&I had become a greater priority for them because of the events of summer 2020. And it's important to call out in this pie chart on the prioritization column that 24% of companies who disagreed with this statement. As we looked more holistically at the information we had gathered and looked at those companies who had said they disagreed with that statement, we saw that they were often the ones that were more advanced in this space. So one potential explanation for this 24% could be that DE&I was already a high priority for them prior to the events of summer 2020. And so the summer itself didn't have that big of an impact on making it a greater priority because it was already a high priority within their company. The second key shift was buy-in and interest. This was particular to leadership buy-in, though employees also in general were more engaged with DE&I. From the surveys, we saw that 96% of companies agreed that HR leaders were bought into the DEI strategy, and 93% said that C-suite leaders were bought into DE&I strategy and initiatives. The third shift we saw here was that 45% of companies said the DE&I function had undergone some kind of change because of the events of summer 2020. And though 45% may seem low for such a big event that happened last year, we have to think of this in terms of how powerful a movement has to be in order to get nearly half of all companies to change something about themselves in such a short period of time. And when it came to this changing teams shift, there were really 2 ways that this occurred in most companies. So the first was an increase in the number of DEI related positions or roles. So essentially companies were just expanding their DEI teams and hiring more people. And the second way that this shift occurred was some kind of restructuring to the DEI function. So things like changing where DEI was housed in the company, changing their scope of responsibility or who they reported to. The fourth key shift that we saw was in line with conversations. So here there was an increase or a greater emphasis on workplace conversations about DEI. And this we saw through both formal and informal channels. So informally, companies were saying that they just felt like their employees were talking more openly about DEI related topics. Essentially, it wasn't seen as much of a taboo or something that you didn't talk about at work. Though the conversations were still serious and sensitive, companies felt that employees and colleagues were talking more openly with one another. Through the formal channel, we saw many companies holding listening sessions or some kind of equivalent. In fact, 81% of companies reported holding listening sessions in 2020 because of what happened in the summer. And in line with conversations as well, some companies even created conversational framework tools or resources that could be used by anyone within the company to talk about DE&I issues or concerns. And these tools essentially functioned as ready-made scaffolding to guide productive and successful conversations around DEI. So the scaffolding often replaced messy or ad hoc conversations that were put into place when a DEI question was raised in the company. So a tangible example of this is when the US began to see a rise in anti-Asian violence, these conversational framework tools that had been created over the summer slid into place automatically and provided employees a place to feel heard and supported, and gave leaders a resource to use in order to react quickly to the concerns of their employees. Kind of like how oxygen masks will automatically drop down into plane when there's an issue with the air pressure, these conversational tools that some companies created were meant to engage instantly and make sure there was no lag time or mistakes made when critical DEI conversations needed to be held. The fifth key shift that we saw was with commitments. So many companies made additional public statements and commitments to social justice and racial equity, specifically in response to the events of summer 2020. And here we saw these commitments fall into 5 main categories that are pretty broad, but there was monetary donations that often related to DEI causes external to the company. Commitments were also about community investment, which often revolved around how the company would show up in the communities with which it worked. Another commitment was partnerships with social justice organizations. So we saw many companies talk about partnering with the 110 organization and making those partnerships with other companies external to themselves. You also saw some commitments center around increasing internal representation of minorities, especially within leadership roles of the company or leadership development programs. And then the last main broad category of commitments were commitments to increasing supplier diversity. And then the last key shift was in terms of transparency. So this was a space that was new for a lot of companies. And through our interviews, we got the sense that there were a lot of questions and uncertainty around this topic. But what we did see that some companies were finding ways to be more transparent, both internally and externally, in regard to the information of DE&I that they had. So an example of this is that 98% of companies said they had some kind of numeric DEI goals within their company. And many of them were now pivoting and trying to find ways to be transparent about those goals to one degree or another. And many of the questions and concerns we saw in our research revolved around a company or companies wanting to be more transparent, but not necessarily knowing how or what to be transparent about. And later today in this meeting, actually, Boeing will be sharing with us a little bit more about transparency and what they've done. But we definitely saw that there was a shift in how transparency was being viewed by companies when it came to DEI. It was now seen more as a calculated risk that needed to be carefully considered and then taken, rather than a liability to be avoided at all costs.
Great. So as Ethan mentioned, the events of 2020 increased companies' speed and appetite for DEI action, but we also recognize that every organization is at a very different stage in their DEI journey. And we were able to use a combination of quantitative and qualitative data in organizations' assessment of their own maturity in this space to come to these 3 distinct stages. So as we considered where organizations fell on the spectrum, we also saw some clear commonalities on where organizations were focusing their DEI efforts. So about 37% of participating companies fell in the first stage, which encompass emerging organizations. So these are organizations that are focused on developing their DEI strategy and building out the foundational infrastructure to support their DEI work. Next on the DEI journey is the advancing stage, where we also saw about 37% of companies fall. And unlike emerging organizations, companies in this stage have a clearly defined DEI strategy, but are now focused on executing on that strategy and making sure that through HR and DEI teams, they're engaging different employee groups on their initiatives. And the last stage captures those organizations that are truly leading in this space, which is where we saw about 25% of companies fall. And this group has been executing on their DEI strategy for some time now and is now more focused on integrating DEI across all processes enterprise-wide beyond just HR. And they're thinking also about how to sustain this work long-term. So across these three stages, emerging, advancing, and leading, we uncovered some clear patterns in what companies in each stage were focusing on based on their DEI maturity. And we were actually able to dive into what these priorities were. And this brings us to this framework that we developed, which maps DEI priorities based off of what organizations are seeking to drive at their companies and where they are at each stage on the journey. So I know that there's a lot here, and we hope that you take a look at our full white paper on the research that will be published to CAHRS next month so that you can dig into some of these details. But I wanted to call out a few things here before showing you this framework in action. So there were 6 key issue areas that came up as the top DEI priorities, and those were infrastructure, diversity, inclusion, integration, accountability, and equity. So these are what companies want to drive in relation to their DEI strategy. And there are specific action steps that we saw organizations in each stage were constantly and consistently taking to meet these priorities. And I want to show you this in action with a specific example from this framework. So we've highlighted integration here because it's something that we saw as a priority across all companies, but it looked very different depending on which stage you were at on the journey. So for many companies, integration means embedding DEI practices into current practices in the organization. So for emerging organizations, this looked like incorporating DEI into company values and embedding DEI language into their employee value proposition. For one company we spoke to, DEI was initially not tied to their company values and when those values were drafted, but it wasn't until this past year that they reevaluated and updated those values to serve as leadership anchors. And one of those anchors focused on inclusion specifically. For companies looking to build that core awareness of DEI within their organization, these steps are important to make sure that DEI is top of mind for employees. For companies in the advancing stage, integration was much more about actively building DEI into talent processes and empowering leaders with the data and tools they needed across the business to meet their DEI goals. So this requires HR leaders in talent acquisition and performance management and HR business partners and many more to help execute the DEI strategy. And for example, one organization we spoke to recently mandated a 50% diverse slate for interviewers and for interviewees. And another required all business unit leaders to develop a strategic DEI-focused business plan for their organization. So for leading organizations, integration was about making sure that DEI is a part of every system and thought process in the company, and also about ensuring that this work can be scaled globally. So one company that we spoke to developed a decision-making tree through their global DEI council to ensure that issues occurring at the local level in their offices abroad were being addressed, even if they fell outside of enterprise priorities. So we hope that this framework will be useful to companies to get a sense of where they might focus their DEI efforts as they progress through their DEI journey.
So the second research objective we had was in finding key opportunities for HR and for DEI teams where they could really focus to get the most return for their actions and essentially advance the DEI within the company. So as we looked at the interviews, we found that there were 4 main areas of opportunity. So the first one was embedding DEI. This was particularly into talent processes or the talent pipeline of HR. Dhara just talked a little bit about that, what embedding it looks like and integrating it into the company. And later today in this meeting, Accenture will be talking a little bit more about what they've done in regard to embedding DEI to the organization as a whole. The second key opportunity we found was about increasing accountability. So this goes for accountability, not just for the organization as a whole, but for leaders and people leaders and employees as well, really trying to find ways to make people accountable for the DEI actions. So they're not just aspirations, but that they're goals with specific people responsible for them. The third key opportunity was listening to employees. So HR, especially here, has a chance to leverage the voice of employees who are oftentimes the biggest stakeholders when it comes to DEI. And again, as part of Boeing's presentation later today, they'll also be talking about what they've done in this space of employee listening. And the fourth key opportunity for HR to focus on was about building inclusion. And the idea behind this opportunity is to find ways to bolster inclusion in your workplace rather than just focusing on diversity. And this was actually a really common topic that came up in our interviews. And many companies wanted to know how they could do a better job of building an inclusive environment at work. So as Dhara and I parsed through the data that we had around inclusion, we began to see another framework emerge that had led us to what was essentially a roadmap to inclusion. So on this roadmap, there are 4 main milestones a company should focus on hitting. And as they kind of progress along this roadmap, they're able to build inclusion and embed it so that it's a sustainable part of their culture. And it's important that along this roadmap, there are these four checkpoints, and they have to be hit sequentially since they do add and build upon one another. So for the first step of defining inclusion, unlike diversity, inclusion is a little less well-defined and it's sometimes more abstract. However, that doesn't mean that it can't be defined. So the key takeaway from this step is that companies should be intentional, proactive, and specific about defining what exactly inclusion looks like. So an example of how some companies went about doing this in their own organization was that they created an actual list of inclusive behaviors that employees could reference to see what inclusion looked like. And obviously these lists weren't exhaustive in nature, but they did serve as great reminders and reference points for what exactly inclusion looks like at that company. The second milestone here in this roadmap is to measure inclusion. And the key takeaway here is that we know what gets measured gets better. So some common tools for measuring inclusion were things like employee surveys and focus groups. We heard a lot about inclusion indices that companies would use to kind of gauge how inclusive their employees were rating their environment to be. As one company told us, they had a robust diet of employee feedback and input because the more diversified our measurement tools are, the better and more accurate those measurements are going to be. The third step here is communication. So here, the key takeaway is that once you've defined inclusion and set about measuring it, now comes the real work of continual promotion and communication, because you can't let it fall to the back burner if you want it to integrate successfully into your culture. So some real world examples of how companies communicated inclusion to their employees were by doing things like providing ongoing education and training around inclusion and inclusive behaviors, holding recurring events themed around inclusivity, creating rewards for employees who exemplified the inclusive behaviors that had been defined previously by the company. And with these rewards, kind of making a big deal about it and making it very public when someone was awarded that. And then leveraging and building internal and external partnerships. So this was like the businesses using employee resource groups or DEI task forces to make sure inclusion and inclusivity were being constantly communicated. Essentially, the important part for the communicate part of this roadmap is just to communicate, and always let it be on top of mind for the company. And then the last step is embedding inclusion. So here, the goal is to build accountability into systemic processes, because accountability is going to be a catalyst that will boost inclusion efforts and make them greater than they otherwise would have been. So some examples of what embedding inclusion looked like in the companies we interviewed, things like mandating diverse slates for job interviews, like Dhara had mentioned, setting inclusive goals as part of performance management, finding ways to increase the company's transparency around inclusion efforts and information. And we even saw some companies who were beginning to tie compensation to whether or not inclusion metrics were being met, and whether or not those were things that people were receiving. So this roadmap isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to building an inclusive culture. However, as Dhara and I looked at all of the information we had gotten throughout the semester, we saw these 4 steps pop up time and time again, over and over. as actions that whenever companies were trying to embed inclusion into their company, these were actions that they would take.
Great. So at this point, we know that this last year has led to a true evolution in the DEI space, from organizations shifting priorities to the opportunities that have emerged for HR as a result. And we wanted to share some findings that relate to our third and final research objective, where we sought to understand what the next evolution of DE&I will look like. The questions we've mapped out here are what organizations are thinking about and actively working to address, but that many seasoned DE&I leaders are still grappling with. So the first is, how do we drive engagement among disparate groups? So there were 4 employee groups that showed up again and again that organizations were working to engage when it came to the organization's DE&I strategy. So the first are middle managers. Companies were seeing a great deal of buy-in from top leaders in their organization, but we heard from a lot of groups that described the frozen middle or the unmovable middle as managers who were more challenging to reach when it came to engaging on their DE&I strategy, even though this group has the potential to have a tremendous impact on the organization's diversity and inclusion efforts. The next group were employees outside of the US. So because DE&I teams are largely based in the United States, priorities tend to be very US centric. And with many CAHRS companies being global organizations, there is a definite need to re-examine how organizations are reaching this group. And the third group companies are looking to engage are actually frontline workers, which was really interesting. So we spoke to companies in manufacturing and in CPG who have a large number of employees in plants and also in retail stores, who were challenging to engage due to the lack of access to digital tools for training and the lack of mechanisms for those employees to actually have a voice on DE&I issues at the company compared to corporate employees. And the last group that came up often were detractors. So these were individuals in the company who saw DEI as a zero-sum game or had a fixed pie mentality when it came to this topic, essentially feeling that DE&I was being talked about too much or worried that they were being left out of the conversation if they did not belong to an underrepresented group. What is really promising, though, is that organizations are coming up with really innovative ways to engage these employees and iterating on a lot of different strategies. But there's definitely still a long way to go when it comes to this question. And so as we look to the future, there is definitely a lot of opportunity here. And the other key question as we look to the future, what companies are really going to face in the next evolution of DEI is, how do we make this work sustainable for the long term? So there are 3 topics relevant to this idea, and the first is around burnout. So DEI work often involves a lot of emotional labor, especially for employees of color. And for many organizations that we spoke to, DEI is still being done on a largely voluntary basis, so on top of existing roles or through employee resource groups. So there will have to be a continuous investment in DEI and mechanisms in place to ensure that employees can still thrive doing this work. The next topic is how organizations might strengthen the connection between DEI, corporate social responsibility, human rights, and ESG goals. So there can definitely be a great deal of overlap between the goals of organizations in their effort to become better corporate citizens. And we spoke to several DEI leaders who are thinking about how to increase collaboration across these teams to develop a broader definition of what success for the organization looks like, which will be really relevant for the evolving marketplace. And the final topic is around how organizations can actually work together to make a greater impact on society. So often companies see the success of their DEI efforts as a competitive advantage that will attract and retain the right talent. But through our research, Ethan and I recognize that organizations are actually really eager to learn from one another, whether it's continuing to share best practices and grapple with some of these difficult questions together in forums like CAHRS, or increasing that transparency that we discussed earlier today. Organizations are thinking about how to collaborate in the long term. There is so much collective power and influence that corporations have that can be ultimately harnessed to create a better world. So thank you everyone for your attention, and to all of the CAHRS partners who participated in our project. We are truly so inspired by the work that you're doing and your leadership in this space. And we really look forward to seeing how you all and organizations everywhere progress towards a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Dhara and Ethan. Great presentation. Certainly great set of insights for our CAHRS companies to take away, and as well as kind of some food for thought in terms of thinking about what might be next. So we'd love to take your questions. We already had a number submitted, which we'll tackle, but encourage others to please submit your questions. So, the first question, relates to something you talked about, Ethan, which was one of the key shifts over the last year was kind of increased commitments by companies to various kind of DE&I agenda elements. And the question is, did you see some of these commitments made by companies specifically with historically Black colleges and universities? And if so, what was most impactful? And as well as, do you see this as a long-term trend? Will this be something that you expect to kind of continue going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as we went through and these companies were kind of explaining to us the different commitments that they had made because of the summer of 2020, a lot of it did revolve around giving back to the the Black community in one way or another, just because that was a lot of the focus on racial equity and social justice. There were, of course, companies doing a lot in the space of other minorities, especially like women in leadership. But the increase we had seen in commitments, because specifically of summer 2020, did revolve around partnering with like Black-led organizations, doing commitments for recruiting on these historically Black colleges and universities. So I think, and Dhara, you can add to this, we saw this more as kind of companies showing their support for the community that was hurting during the summer. So I think there is an aspect of that, though it was probably like the they made these monetary donations that were maybe a one-time thing, but the commitments of investing in the community and making sure that there was representation in their leadership, that is definitely an ongoing commitment that a lot of companies are focusing on to make it more sustainable for the future.
Yeah, and that's great, Ethan. The only thing I'll add to that is, yeah, I think I agree that organizations are now thinking more about how they're addressing historical injustices and what they're doing in that effort. And I think prioritizing uplifting the Black community in particular is definitely going to be something we see moving forward.
Great, thanks. So another question relates to something you talked about, Dhara, when you're talking about integration across those kind of 3 different levels of maturity. You talked about the companies really kind of pushing these diverse panels and slates and recruiting and hiring. So the question is, how is this being measured? And in particular, how are companies defining what a diverse slate looks like? Is this just in terms of kind of racial and gender diversity, or are they looking at other factors such as veteran status, disability, et cetera? So what does a diverse slate actually look like in practice for different organizations?
Yeah, so that's great. To answer the first part of the question, we definitely saw when talking to companies that they're really trying to rely on empirical data when making these decisions. So in terms of mandatory slates, for example, we talked to companies who had attended conferences and who had looked to outside research to understand at what point is a diverse slate actually effective or will actually bring diversity into the organization, as opposed to arbitrarily saying, 30% diverse slate or 50% diverse slate. They really want to ground their DE&I decisions in data-driven decision-making. So that was definitely something that we saw. And in terms of what makes up a diverse slate, I think right now many organizations are focusing on gender and underrepresented minority groups. However, an interesting trend that we saw as well is that organizations are also reevaluating what credentials are really needed to fit jobs that they're trying to fill. So we saw folks starting to think about getting rid of particular educational requirements, for example, in job postings, and trying to reevaluate what a diverse resume looks like. So we think that the definition of diversity is really going to expand beyond just race and gender.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well. As companies one of the questions that we said looking to the future was kind of finding ways to help engage disparate groups, right? So one of the aspects of that was making sure that companies were open to feedback from their employees saying, hey, I feel like this is an aspect of a diversity or an inclusion that I'm not seeing a lot in the company. And so really getting that employee feedback and having the organization be flexible enough to say, oh, you know what, you're right. Like we hadn't considered that as something that is considered as diverse. We'll take that into consideration going forward. That was an aspect of engaging those disparate groups that maybe are diverse, but have fallen onto the back burner or maybe don't get as much attention.
So you talked about different, 4 key areas of opportunity in this space. And, one of the questions that was submitted was, in highlighting these areas of opportunities, are you suggesting that HR is not doing these things in terms of, embedding DE&I or increasing accountability? Or is it just that we're kind of at an earlier stage of maturity in these areas, or this is where we have the greatest opportunity for growth going forward? I mean, what kind of led you to focus on these 4 areas?
Yeah, so if we go back to the priorities matrix that Dhara talked about, right, there was a lot there, right? There are 6 different areas depending on where you fall. So when we say those 4 key areas of opportunity, those were not necessarily because HR wasn't doing anything in that space already, but more that as we looked at the information that the interviews had brought in and the surveys, those 4 areas were essentially where if HR acted, or increase their presence in those spaces, they would get a lot of return on investment, essentially, where they can put in a certain amount of effort and they get the most out of those actions that they took. So obviously there's so many other areas that HR and DEI can be involved in, but those 4 key areas of opportunity were really where we saw companies getting the most, I guess, bang for their buck, you could say, depending on the effort that they were putting.
Great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So another question here is, did you see or hear from any of the companies innovative ways that they're trying to engage employees from the majority group? Allyship efforts, other things that companies are doing to really, engage them as kind of, key partners in these efforts.
Yeah, definitely. So that was definitely something that organizations are thinking about. I think training has been a big part of that. So we saw pretty much every organization that we spoke to talked about mandatory unconscious bias training or opt-in training of one form or another to engage sort of the majority group on these issues, especially for folks who may not have engaged with these issues prior, especially in the workplace prior to last summer. And then what Ethan talked a lot about in terms of like those conversations and those courageous conversations on identity, race, allyship, were definitely prioritized as well. So open invitations to those types of conversations in the workplace were also something that was being used to engage that majority.
Great. So a lot of questions here around how companies are trying to engage those 4 kind of disparate groups you talked about, Dhara. And in particular, it's a lot of questions about how do we get to the detractors, as well as, a lot of attention around the kind of global piece of this. How do we really kind of translate this globally? So can you talk a little bit or maybe highlight a few kind of innovative practices you saw there from companies?
Yeah, so I'll start with that group of detractors. I know that this is an area that a lot of companies are thinking about and honestly are still grappling with. And I think companies are approaching it in a lot of different ways. I think channels for employee listening are a big factor. So having ways for to hear what employees are thinking and engaging with them on these topics is really important. And it kind of overlaps with how I answered the last question. So making sure that there's a base level understanding through training, there's open invitations to courageous conversations is a big part of it. And then in terms of the employees outside of the US, which as another group a lot of folks are thinking about, I think there are a few things here. So companies are trying to make sure that there is ownership over global DE&I. So they're creating those decision-making trees to address local issues, even if they fall outside of companies' immediate priorities. So making sure that there's a channel in place to have an ear to the ground to what's going on locally in different parts of the company that aren't in the US is a big factor. And then I would also say that right, depending on the country you're operating in, you have to navigate DE&I differently. And so organizations are thinking about how to focus on representation in other countries in different ways. So apart from race, for example, gender was huge. So reaching gender parity in particular countries was a really important priority for some organizations. And ultimately making every conversation a global conversation, right? So everyone needs a certain level of global perspective and cultural competence. So making sure that that is at the front and center was something companies are trying to make sure that they do.
Great. So a lot of questions coming in about metrics, analytics, calculating ROI. I'm going to table those for now because we have a faculty discussion later. John Hausknecht, one of our faculty members, been doing a number of working groups on DE&I analytics, so he can tackle some of those questions. But I think there's an interesting question that was raised, and again, it goes back to the commitment piece that you talked about, Ethan. The question kind of gets at how do we know which of these are really going to stick, and how do we make sure that from a company standpoint, they're really, authentic efforts to really kind of engage the community? Your thoughts on that, or how companies are maybe thinking about that? Again, kind of goes to the sustainability piece.
Yeah, I would think the first consideration in that realm, obviously companies, when something happens, especially if it's very public or it's very tragic, companies want to do something, the employees want to do something, and it's hard not to make those commitments look performative in nature. So a lot of it comes down to being able to listen enough. And this idea of humble leadership often was brought up when we talked with the people that we interviewed, whether it was CDOs or head of talents, the idea of listening to someone just to listen to what they're saying rather than trying to justify why the problem exists or find a solution for it. And as you listen to the people who are being affected by these issues, you can go beyond just like a knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, we'll throw money at the problem, or oh, we're going to start this new program. And you can really get to the root cause of what's causing it. And so I think many times one way that you can tackle that problem with making sure you're making the right commitments is listening to the people who the commitments are supposed to serve, because oftentimes they're not going to come to you just with problems, but if you have the right kind of leadership and the right kind of training, you can also let them help you find the right solution.
Great. So another question here, you talked a lot about, again, the hiring process, diverse slates, but the question kind of gets at what are companies doing on the evaluation, performance management side to reduce kind of bias in those, kind of post-hiring processes? And, unconscious bias training seems to be one thing that companies are doing in that area. Maybe you could elaborate on that, as well as talk about other things you might have heard companies mention with regard to performance management specifically.
Yeah, so a lot of companies we spoke to are thinking a lot about inclusive leadership behaviors and incorporating that into their leadership development training. And within those inclusive leadership behaviors, inclusion we saw tends to typically show up a lot, and other aspects of DE&I as a way to hold leaders accountable to their teams and to those that they're managing. So that's one example, I think, of how companies post the hiring process are holding managers and leaders accountable to creating that inclusive environment for their employees.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe one more here. Kind of asked about integration of DE&I with business strategy, but also interestingly kind of asked about engagement with the board on DE&I efforts. As you talk to companies, did you hear any mention of kind of board involvement, board holding kind of accountability around this space, or just more broadly, how companies are really trying to align this with their kind of business goals and objectives?
Yeah, so one of the things that popped up that was really high in the surveys, and I had shared this in the leadership buy-in section of one of those key shifts, is that a lot of companies said, 96% of their HR leaders were bought in, 93% said their C-suite leaders were bought in. So we did see a lot of companies saying, at the very top of the company, we had a lot of support. So that was really good. So that was, C-suite leaders, a lot of the board of directors. So we didn't see too many companies saying, oh, we have the middle managers really bought in, but our leadership isn't bought in. So that wasn't an issue that was raised too much in the interviews that we did, but we did see when top leaders weren't as bought in as they could be, there was almost no getting the DE&I off the ground. So as much as we want to focus on middle managers, really trying to get the buy-in first of top leadership was essential in making sure your DE&I function was able to get rolling and move quickly.
Makes a lot of sense. Kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition for DE&I success. Well, Dhara, Ethan, thank you so much. Again, great presentation, great research, and appreciate all your insights, and as well as following up on the great questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, we're going to transition now and kind of follow up on Dhara and Ethan's presentation and do a deep dive now, looking at some specific company practices. We're really happy to have both Accenture and Boeing featured here with us today. This segment will be led by my colleague, Beth Flynn Ferry, who serves as the Executive Director of CAHRS. And prior to joining us here at Cornell, worked for over 25 years in HR roles in corporate America, mostly in HRBP roles. So she's kind of been, both on the academic and practice side of this, and will be facilitating the discussion with our company guests. Beth?
Great, thank you, Brad. Ethan and Dhara, terrific job. And I'm really pleased now to turn to our company spotlights. And the two folks that we're going to meet today were interviewed by Ethan and Dhara as part of the presentation that they just did, but they're going to focus in on a couple of the areas that we know there are lots of questions about and that are really creative DE&I practices. These are going to be shorter presentations, so probably 7 to 10 minutes. And then, we'll have time for questions at the end. So again, I encourage you to submit those through the Q&A function. So first up, we're going to have Yolanda Friend from Accenture. Yolanda is the Inclusion and Diversity Strategic Programs Lead for North America. She joined Accenture in 2006 and she spent her first 10 years there working on the client side before moving into her current role. And she has an MBA from Florida A&M. I'm also going to introduce Sarah Bowen from Boeing. I had to ask for sure to get that straight. Sarah joined Boeing in 2019 as the Vice President, Global Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Prior to that, she was Starbucks Global Leader of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. And Sarah earned her BS from Northwestern and her law degree from Stanford Law School. So I want to welcome both of you. Yolanda is going to go first, and then Sarah will be up next. So Yolanda.
Yes, thank you, Beth. Appreciate the introduction. Very happy to be here with all of you. Just a bit about my role at Accenture. I work across teams to establish our strategic priorities for North America that ultimately help Accenture attract, develop, retain, and advance our diverse talent. I prepare our gender and ethnicity workforce demographic goals. We ultimately want our company to reflect the demographics of where we live and work. And I oversee some key areas of the team, our employee resource groups, our professional development offerings, and our I&D partnerships. So thank you all again for your interest in the work that we do. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to participate in this event. So as Beth mentioned, I was asked to come talk a little bit about how Accenture is reducing bias in our processes. I thought I'd start by first talking a little bit about the foundation that Accenture has in place that really allows us to tackle topics like bias reduction in meaningful and impactful ways that has strong leadership support. So first and foremost, inclusion and diversity are top business imperatives for our CEO. There are a variety of reasons for this. Not only is it the right thing to do, but our clients and the customers of our clients are diverse. We have to be a diverse organization to create solutions that are meaningful for them. Second, diverse companies achieve stronger returns and we're more innovative. So our own research really shows that equality drives innovation and performance. If we advance one more slide, much like other companies represented on this call, we have publicly stated diversity goals, outlining what the composition of our workforce should be over time to better reflect our communities. So our leaders are held accountable for achieving these goals and measured accordingly. So progress against the goals are tracked with the same rigor as other key metrics like sales and revenue. This is an important point because having this leadership accountability ultimately will garner support for efforts like bias reduction. The presence of bias will erode inclusion and therefore diminish progress against these goals. I also want to call out, we heavily leverage metrics and advanced analytics to understand where bias could be at play when it comes to hiring, developing, promoting, rewarding, and staffing our people onto project teams. So we assess if there is parity or, unfortunately, disparity between minority and majority populations. The idea is that proportionally, underrepresented populations should be hired, promoted, retained, et cetera, at the same rate as majority populations. So our leadership teams are primed to review this data on a regular basis. The last piece is our culture. It's infused with an awareness, of what bias is and how it shows up. Neuroscience tells us that if you have a brain, you have bias. So we can't get away from it. It's almost impossible to be completely unbiased. So to that end, and as many companies are doing, based on all the great research the CAHRS team has done, unconscious bias training. It's important. It does build that awareness. And it's also more effective when it's supported by interventions that address bias as it happens. So I'll talk a little bit more about this shortly in my presentation. Also, all of our US people are required to take mandatory training to identify and report racism. And this was a new development that was implemented just this past year. So the last piece I'll mention before I kind of dive in, we have a strong willingness among our people to self-identify their gender, ethnicity, if there is a disability at play, if they have their military status, LGBTQ status, and all of these data points are essential to understanding the needs of our workforce. So we have to understand, who's out there and what the needs are. So I will say that having the underpinning of leadership accountability, this culture of awareness, and the deep analytics helps create the appetite and leadership support that is needed to take action to eliminate bias from our talent lifecycle. So I will spend just a little bit of time now sharing examples on how we're doing this. So on top of the routine metrics that can quickly show areas of disparity, deeper analytics help us determine the root cause. So for example, in the hiring process, we analyze the likelihood of minority versus majority populations to progress through each stage of the application, interview, and offer stages. So as areas of opportunity are uncovered, we can more effectively implement the right behavioral nudge. So identifying the root cause is critical. In this example, we could have originally been thinking, wow, we need to get more diverse pipelines. But in reality, after reviewing the analysis, the pipeline is strong, but the disparity actually starts to creep up in the interview stage, just as an example. We also heavily rely on metrics to support our staffing process. And this is activated once someone joins our company and needs to be staffed on a project team to support our clients. So the routine metrics can quickly uncover disparity in terms of how long minority versus majority populations are sitting on the bench, waiting to be staffed on a project. But deeper analytics can offer more around the root cause. So for example, we can pursue a deeper analysis to determine if there are certain factors that correlate to the length of time someone's waiting to be staffed on a project. Is it the presence of a profile picture on an internal resume? Is it the tenure? Are they an experienced hire or someone who's kind of grown up in the company? Is there a correlation based on the college that this individual went to? So once all of these root causes are uncovered, actions can be taken. In the case of staffing, we've actually even taken things a step further by partnering with neuroscientists to help us really further assess where we can tackle bias in this process. So now I just kind of want to switch gears and talk about examples of the behavioral nudges that help address bias in our company. And I'll start with an example again from the hiring process. As Dhara talked about earlier, we're one of the companies that carefully assesses job descriptions to make sure they are inclusive. So for example, if we were to include a statement like prior consulting experience required in our descriptions, then we have to ask ourselves, is this really true? a statement like this could automatically limit the pool of candidates to the demographics of the consulting industry. Another example from our performance management process, which I know some questions came up around earlier. We've run a few pilots where we've trained a new role called an equality champion. And that person is present during talent discussions to ensure a couple things. They want to make sure that equal time is being spent discussing each person's contributions. And then they specifically listen for different types of bias. So they consider whether comments or decisions would be considered fair if roles were reversed. So for example, if the individual was of a different gender or a different race, a culture, ability, or background, and they're not there to accuse people of bias. They're really there to ask questions and just, really be intentional about whether or not bias is being introduced into a process. So wrapping up, I think overall what we found that works well is, building awareness with our key decision makers and leaders around how and where bias can creep in, showcasing data that validates instances of bias, and then encouraging small behavioral shifts for real-time interventions. Hopefully this has given you a better sense of how Accenture is tackling bias, and Beth and team, thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Yolanda. Before we buck it over to Sarah, a couple questions did come in, so I'll direct those to you, Yolanda.
Sure.
First one was, how do you differentiate target goals by function? So for example, do you have greater focus on underrepresented people in technical positions? What does Accenture do there?
I wouldn't say it's targeted by function, but what I will say is that, when it comes to gender, the country and the demographics, for example, the US is pretty much split half and half, male, female. But when it comes to ethnicity, that's a little bit more unique because there are certain, clearly, parts of our country that do have a greater pool of ethnically diverse talent. So some of that could be more, location-led decision-making and prioritization. So it's really, we let the demographics, I guess, drive our strategy there.
Okay. Yeah, another one is about addressing data privacy concerns regarding self-identified data outside the US. How are you thinking about that at Accenture?
From a gender perspective, I mean, there are very clear data privacy laws that are governed, and our employees do know what their data can and can't be used for when it's disclosed. In terms of gender, that's pretty much, we're able to track that globally. When it comes to ethnicity, there's really only 3 countries where we're able to pursue that information, the US, the UK, and South Africa. So that's where we're tracking the ethnicity data. In terms of other kind of the other diversity dimensions, military status, LGBTQ status, having a disability, that is more distinct and unique geography by geography. There are different laws that govern the ability to collect that data.
It's complicated, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of questions came in too on this interesting idea of equality champions. How do you decide who should serve in those roles? How do you prepare them and train them?
That's a great question. Thanks for all of these questions. So for an equality champion, it's really anyone who's involved in the decision-making around the performance management process. And ultimately, the entire set of decision makers are trained and enabled to serve as equality champions, but then we designate one person as on point to really be honing in and listening for those conversation topics to, ask those questions that really uncover where bias might be creeping into a conversation. So it's really everyone's job to serve as an equality champion who's part of those discussions, but we do give that designation specifically to one person to really monitor it and keep everyone on track.
Okay. And I'll ask one more question and then we'll go to Sarah. So someone asked, what specifically triggered you to engage with neuroscientists to eliminate bias during the recruitment process? Were you seeing that you had low diversity numbers? What prompted that?
It's really just, Accenture, we're just pursuing all avenues to see, are there areas that we can uncover that can help us do better. It's not to resolve any kind of known deficiencies or address anything in particular, but it's an avenue that we are willing to explore in order to be the most knowledgeable caretakers of our people when it comes to bias. I mean, it's something that we definitely want to make sure is eliminated, mitigated in any way possible. So this was an interesting space that we wanted to explore.
Okay, terrific. Thanks, Yolanda. And we do have a couple more questions, but we'll take those at the end. So
okay.
Sarah, you want to share a little bit about what's happening at Boeing? You're on mute, Sarah.
All right. Can you hear me now? All right, good. All right. I was in the midst of thanking Dhara and Ethan for their fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed hearing the insights from all of the research you did. And I want to foot stomp something that you shared, which is that, we are stronger when we do this work together as companies and organizations. This is inclusion is not a competitive sport. So I want to reiterate that message and also put a call out to all the other companies and organizations out there. Boeing would love to partner to advance inclusion and equity globally, however we can, because all ships will rise. So I wanted to share a couple of things that the Boeing company has been doing. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Two topics. One is around transparency, and the other is around a culture effort we've launched called Seek, Speak, and Listen. So if I am able to do this, I think I can. Am I sharing? I am. Okay. So last summer, about a year ago, we as a company, like many organizations, took a really hard look at ourselves and where we were in terms of racial equity. We put together a racial equity steering team, and we sat down and mapped out 19 specific commitments around race equity. One of those commitments was to be transparent. And for a company like Boeing that has always been very careful with its data, very cautious about sharing, this is a very bold move. But we know that in order to come out the other side of this, to really make a difference, to really move the needle, we have to be transparent. Transparency not only drives accountability, which is hugely important, but it also empowers us as a workforce. When we all are singing from the same score, we all know where we stand, we know where we're heading, we become empowered to be allies on the journey. So we launched the company's first ever public report on diversity and inclusion just a few weeks ago. The company's almost 105 years old. This is the first of its kind. So it is a big deal, and it's the first, but won't be the last, because we've committed to do this every single year. We committed to doing something that was honest, that was clear and specific. And when I say that, I mean it's not a report full of corporate speak. I think it is not full of cliches. It is not the metrics we share are not numbers we're particularly proud of. It is simply the truth. It is simply where we are, what we're working on, and where we think we're heading. So on this slide, I've just pulled out a few images, right? We know we want our report to be very people forward, because it's the people that drive the outcomes, and our people are amazing, and this helps us drive inclusion. We share our data, and I've done a little excerpt there, but you can go check out our public report. We've done more cuts of data by more groups and subgroups than I think any of our peer companies. Again, not as a bragging point, but because we need to put it out there so that we can get better and move through it. We've outlined 6 very specific aspirations in terms of goals. And then the other thing we did was acknowledge what's not in the report, right? We don't yet have good data around LGBTQ. We don't yet have good data around disability. We are not in this report sharing intersectional data yet. We know these are important aspects of diversity. We want to get to that place, and we're just not there yet. But we thought rather than just be silent on it, we wanted to acknowledge it and explain why we're not there yet. So that's what I wanted to share around transparency and you know, how we got to the final result. This was all built in-house, by the way. We didn't hire a PR firm to do this. We spent a lot of time with our employees. The comments about listening that Dhara and Ethan shared, we spent a lot of time listening to our people. We spent a lot of time with our racial equity task force, with our business resource groups, hearing from them what was important to include in the report. And we factored in that input in the final result. We also engaged, before we launched it, a couple of firms just to poke as many holes in this as they could, so that we went in eyes wide open and we were fully prepared. And that kind of self-critical work, that really leaning into listening, even if it's uncomfortable, is the path we're on, because we know it's what we need to do to get better. And that leads me to the next thing that I wanted to share, which is an effort we recently deployed at our company that we call Seek, Speak, and Listen. Now, this is not couched as a diversity effort, but as I walk you through these habits, you'll see how they are foundational to inclusion. Right? So these three behaviors, number one is seek. And when we talk about seeking, we are talking about leaning into pockets of anxiety, leaning into discomfort, distress, right? All of us, whether we're leaders or individual contributors, we know when there are those moments, right, where people on the team are feeling uncomfortable or anxious about something. And I think oftentimes the human tendency is to want to avoid that, right, not to lean into it. Or, you know, after George Floyd's murder last year, there were a lot of people who kind of didn't want to talk about it because it made them uncomfortable. But we have to lean into that, because that's where we're going to learn. And this is a behavior we've asked every single Boeing employee to lean into. We've got training on it, how to seek, what that looks like. Same with speak, right? Speaking up because it's the right thing to do. Not only speaking up for us as a company in terms of safety and quality and production, but speaking up to address and identify bias, call it out. And we've gotten much more rigorous around that and much more supportive of each other. And then finally, listening, right? Listening not to respond, listening not to judge, but listening truly to learn. That is a shift for many people and for an organization, to be able to stand back and say, I don't have all the answers, and I trust the collective intelligence of this team, of this room, to have the answers. And the way we get there is by genuinely listening to each other. So these habits, I know they sound so simple, but they're very challenging to put into practice in a consistent way. We're really excited about this because we know these habits will drive not only the business outcomes and build stronger teams like we've talked about, but this is inclusion, right? If we treat each other in this way, this is inclusion. And so to the detractors that Ethan and Dhara pointed out on their grid, this is another way to pull people into the inclusion conversation without them even knowing that's what we're doing. These are the habits that drive the outcomes we seek through inclusion, right? It's everyone having a voice, everyone feeling valued. When we're experiencing that discomfort, we get to uncover it so that we get to a better place as a team and as an organization. So Seek, Speak, and Listen, this is Boeing's big kind of culture effort this year. It's embraced at all levels, and we're really excited about it. And that's what I wanted to share.
Thanks, Sarah. I encourage people to put some questions in the Q&A, and I know that there's going to be some that are Sarah, that want more specifics on those 3 steps of Seek, Speak, and Listen. So, you know, just taking Seek, can you give us a couple of the really specific things Boeing is doing to encourage employees to seek?
Yeah, so we also partnered with Neuroscience Institute to help us with Seek. So we created some training, some videos that are very specific to Boeing, but we're asking for people to share their stories. So we have the Seek, Speak, and Listen moments. We have a website that's available to everyone where they share what a seeking moment was for them and what learning it led to. And it might be, someone shared that he was meeting with a team and they were kind of quiet, and then as he continued to seek and ask questions, someone mentioned a bottleneck in this quality process, and then he explored that further, and it was able to uncover a blockage in our system and process that was threatening results, and they were able to address that and change it. So that's what we talk about when we talk about seeking, is pausing in those moments to really listen to what's going on, listen with our ears, but also our hearts, so that we can get through it and into a better place.
Another question on the Seek, Speak, and Listen. How do you implement that across groups?
Yeah, well, we had it was a 4-week program for the month of May. So we did one habit a week for 3 weeks, kind of a sprint. So everyone worked on Seek week 1, everyone worked on Speak week 2, and Listen week 3. And then we're in week 4 right now, which we call our capstone week. This is all socially learned, by the way. Teams are doing this together. And so in week 4, we bring it all together. We create action plans as teams and individual plans as well. So that's our big kickoff. And then throughout the year, we're using behavioral nudges as well to remind people to use the behaviors. We're going to do spotlights and stories and recognition throughout the year to sustain it, but it's also being integrated into everything we do. So our safety management system, our Speak Up portal, leadership messaging, it's being threaded and embedded and integrated in all that we do.
Okay, great. Going back to the transparency piece, there's some questions there. What really led to the shift in perspective at Boeing that had you decide now to publish that data?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, Forbes wrote an article about this transparency and said the fact that Boeing did this year, when we're having so many financial troubles, it's publicly known as a company, really says something about our commitment, and that's true. So why did we do it now? Number one is because it is a very serious commitment. It is from the very top of our company. We know we can't be the company we need to be if we don't get this right. It's not a corporate line. It is believed heart and soul from the top down, at least in the upper levels of leadership. We have been on a path of transparency as a company generally, even outside of the DEI space. We have new leadership. Our CEO is huge on transparency. It's okay for us to make mistakes. We can acknowledge them, we can learn from them, and we get better, right? And there is a power in doing that. It is a growth mindset. It is a continuous learning culture that we're really trying to embrace in everything we do. And diversity inclusion is no exception. So we wanted to put it out there along with everything else we're kind of putting out there, saying this is where we are. It's not where we want to be. And this sets no limit on where we can go, because this is our vision, and we won't stop until we get there.
Well, I think it's just a great example that, even if you are in business challenges, these things are still really important to do to advance there. So that's terrific. You also mentioned you're not able to report yet on some things like intersectionality. How do you get there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Some of it is self-ID campaign. I think Yolanda talked about this too, right? You've got to get, it's data in, data out. So we just launched self-ID for gender identity and sexual orientation this year. Our response rate is very low. And we can't report those numbers until we have a sufficient response rate. So we're really trying to encourage people to self-ID. There's a lot of inclusion messaging that comes along with that as to why it's important. Same with disability, right? There's still so much stigma, unfortunately, attached that people, there's there's not a whole, the message around what's in it for me is not very strong. And so we need to do a better job as a company to convey why we should be doing this. What's in it for a person to go in there and self-disclose this thing that they may feel is very private to them. And so it's things like that, but it's also the bedrock work of ensuring that we have the support in place, the strategies in place, that when we do share the data, it's not going to fall into a vacuum, but that we've got the support structure around it to take action to improve. And so we want to make sure that some of those things are in place as well before we go, really public with some of the numbers.
Okay, great. Well, in our last minute here, Sarah, one last question from an attendee. Who drives the D&I strategy there? Do you have employee leads councils, or do employees lead councils who provide input, or is it more of an HR initiative? What are the basic building blocks there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I report into the CHRO, who is a great champion for diversity inclusion. So we do have that, I think, fairly traditional model, because our primary focus as a B2B, it really is about our talent right now. It's less about the marketplace. So we have that. We have 152 chapters of business resource groups. We have diversity councils at sites. We've just launched an inclusion ambassador network that we bring together every month to help, kind of drive inclusion within their team. So we work it on a number of levels and layers, which I think is absolutely necessary to make this embedded truly in our company's DNA.
All right, terrific. Thank you. I want to thank you as well for being our company spotlights today. I'm sure many of our attendees took away some key insights from what you shared, and we appreciate your partnership and your openness to do this today. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to turn to our next segment, and we're going to have a CAHRS faculty panel. And so I'd like to welcome those folks to the screen with me. We ran a series of DE&I working groups this spring, and each of our participants facilitated those panels. Topics they covered included how companies are facilitating constructive DE&I conversations in the workplace, how to build inclusive cultures, and leveraging analytics to monitor and measure DE&I. Our panelists today include Tony Byers. Tony joined Cornell a couple of years ago and is working with CAHRS as a senior extension associate. Prior to that, he spent 25 plus years leading D&I efforts with Starbucks, as well as Cargill and H.J. Heinz. He has a PhD in human and organizational development from the Fielding Graduate University in California. Welcome, Tony. I'd also like to introduce John Hausknecht. John is a professor of HR studies at Cornell's ILR School and works extensively in HR analytics and staffing related topics such as employee selection and turnover. He received his PhD from Penn State with a major in industrial and organizational psychology and a minor in management. So welcome, John. And Brad's our third panelist, and you guys already know Brad well, so he needs no further introduction. So to my three panelists, I'd like to start with a question. Could you highlight 2 to 3 key takeaways or insights from the working groups that you facilitated? So Brad, why don't I start with you? What were your highlights from facilitating constructive DE&I conversations in the workplace?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. It's a really engaging discussion. I think this is an area that I think, as we saw in some of the earlier presentations, that companies have really kind of focused a lot of attention on, given the events over the past year. And I think, as Sarah highlighted, individuals, employees may be somewhat hesitant to engage in these conversations for fear of saying the wrong thing or just the discomfort that they often involve. But I think companies realize that there's real value in having authentic conversations around things that are happening in this space. I think a few of the interesting things that emerged as we looked at and talked about what different companies were doing to really facilitate these. One is, really adopting both what I would call kind of a top-down and bottom-up approach, right? So certainly a lot of the attention is focused on leaders and managers and really kind of giving them the training and toolkits necessary to have these conversations with their employees. But at the same time, also kind of focusing on kind of these bottom-up efforts. Ethan talked about some of the listening channels that companies are employing to, kind of get those insights from employees that then feed into what should be the content of these conversations. What are those areas that, managers should be talking about with their employees, but also other ways to engage bottom-up in terms of looking to ERGs, for example, to really help facilitate these efforts to expand the reach and audience of who gets involved in these conversations, sessions, et cetera. So, really that I think combination is powerful of, leaders are important, but also recognizing and engaging kind of a grassroots efforts. The other thing I found really interesting was not just how companies are doing it, but what is the focus of these conversations? And a number of the companies talked about that they really don't try to lead these conversations around issues of race and gender, but rather try to focus on these cross-cutting themes of allyship, unconscious bias, covering, privilege, that really cut across and are relevant to any employee. And so that inclusive lens, I think, gives both majority and minority members license to engage in these conversations. And it also helps to facilitate the global kind of translation of these conversations, which we talked about earlier. I'd say the last, interesting insight was, there's, again, this tendency, or we know that people may be anxious, particularly managers, to engage in these conversations. And so there's discussion about, well, how do you manage that? Do you use facilitators to really kind of facilitate these discussions? And I think companies have, by and large, adopted a kind of sink or swim approach, which is we realize this is going to be uncomfortable. We realize that you're probably going to make some mistakes and missteps along the way. And as been discussed in some of the other presentations, really trying to promote a growth mindset where that's okay. We want you to just be authentic, really jump into these. And they've even gone so far as to provide examples of other senior leaders having these conversations, which aren't perfect models, right? They make their own mistakes, and that really creates the psychological safety for all employees to be able to dive into these conversations. So I thought those were some of the key kind of takeaways for me.
Yeah, terrific. John, you want to build on those? What you learned in the DE&I session, analytics?
Sure. So we did a few sessions, Tony Byers and I, on DE&I metrics and analytics, and I kind of bucketed my thoughts into three main areas in terms of what we're seeing companies focus on. So the first area is around maybe more of a classic approach to measuring diversity, and that's around demographic representation. So many companies collecting data on the makeup of their workforce and doing cuts by race, gender, and other demographic characteristics. And I think the new development, which we just heard about with Boeing, and also if you've seen, Verizon also released a human capital report with very detailed demographic data. The new development is the transparency piece of kind of publicly releasing this information, which is something we certainly haven't seen in the past. So that's kind of one main area. And I think for each of these, I'll just highlight a quick challenge too. I think the challenge there around the demographic data piece is that these are sort of lagging indicators, right? It's the product of what you've been doing. And so it's not very forward looking in terms of telling you where you need to focus. I think that brings me to a couple of the other bucket areas. So the second one being around inclusion. And so you've heard a lot about this already today, but just how are we measuring inclusion? What does it mean for us? And then how are we actually collecting the data? So a lot of work around surveys, focus groups, and so forth. The inclusion index idea, whether that's an off-the-shelf measure or creating your own custom index, a lot of work there. I think the challenge that we've heard about is around how you tie that to your strategy and kind of what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. So that does make it difficult to know what to measure and what the right questions are and so forth. So a lot of work going on there. And I think the last area is really interesting to me. It's more around the scientific or analytical approach to DE&I. And it speaks to what Yolanda mentioned around trying to get at some of the causes of what we're seeing. And so a lot of companies are thinking about how do we understand some of the key drivers of where we're at today and what kind of steps can we take to intervene, and then how do we measure and evaluate whether those interventions are effective. And so I think the challenge there has been around the complexity of a project like that, the data required, the resources, and kind of the discipline to be able to execute that over the long term. So those are sort of the three main areas that we heard across the groups.
You know, we had some questions earlier too, John, that I'm going to throw your way and that people are interested in. So can you share some of the ways that companies calculate ROI?
So ROI, we haven't heard a lot of examples of companies doing that. I mean, the classic, you know, think about benefits versus costs, you know, relative to costs, that kind of approach. I think the way companies are approaching it is, like I said, more of this analytical, you know, what are the key drivers here and are we seeing a gain over time? If we make a change to our selection and recruitment processes, are we seeing the downstream impact for a particular group, right? So almost like pilot studies, experimentation, trying to make connections between drivers and outcomes as opposed to just the metrics and tracking, like I said, demographics or inclusion and just measuring that over time. So I think that's been the approach, is more around, you know, seeing if the interventions are having any impact.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know companies are always interested in specifics, right? What are the metrics that companies are using to track D&I?
So, you know, there are a handful of kind of, like I said, more off the shelf, you know, partners, I'm sure that many companies work with to be able to benchmark where they're at on inclusion, or surveys that are sort of been standardized. And then, like I said, the more difficult work, but I think maybe more fruitful areas to think about more custom approaches, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about inclusion, and some may make little sense for your specific employee group or your strategy or your context. And so that approach gives you the chance to, you know, like we heard earlier, listen to your employees, think about what inclusion looks like for you, create your own index, and then track that over time. So, you know, it's a recurring question in any of this: how do we measure it? What's the best way? And of course, it's probably different in many contexts. It's a tricky one to answer.
I got a couple more for you, John, before I come to you, Tony. So are companies looking, John, at key talent and ready now successors for areas where they're underrepresented? And what's the best way to forecast your representation trends?
So I think for the first part of that, yes, we did hear, you know, I think DE&I concerns cutting all the way across, you know, across all areas of the talent life cycle, if you will. And the second part, again, I'll see if I can tie that together. Second part of that question.
What's the best way to forecast your representation trends?
Yeah, I mean, forecasting, you know, the sort of classic workforce planning approach of thinking about transitions. And so we know, you know, whether it's on an annual basis or every 6 months, we can look at historical data and look at the inflows, promotions, exits out across levels, or maybe to other parts of the business, and kind of get an understanding of the flow through. And so you could obviously cut those data by different demographic groups to understand that natural transition pattern. And that, of course, then is the basis for forecasting. Not 100% accurate, but better than nothing to understand sort of what the flow through is for different groups.
Right. And the last question for you for now, John, is, you know, this came up earlier with linking, you know, trying to link metrics to compensation around DE&I. What have you seen there?
Yeah, I've seen both approaches, you know, one of like trying to be very specific about tying metrics to compensation, which is challenging, right? What are the data points and how are you going to actually kind of make that linkage work? We know historically that once you start to measure something and reward for it, it kind of changes the dynamic of the measure in a lot of cases. So that's just kind of a watch out there. And so I think that's what leads to a number of companies not doing that explicitly, but maybe having kind of a softer approach of more of a qualitative assessment of how you've done over the past year relative to what your targets were, your not targets numerical, but just goals for the year were around DE&I. So we've seen that as maybe an alternative to the more quantitative approach of, you know, tying comp directly to specific targets.
Okay, yeah, terrific. Hey, Tony, I know you were part of the analytics group, so you might have a few things to add there, but also I think our group would be interested in the one you were in on building inclusive cultures.
Yes, thank you for that.
Okay.
So, you know, we had a great, you can hear me? Okay, good. We had a great conversation on building inclusive cultures. I think if I tried to sum up some of the points that the groups we're discussing is very similar to what John and Brad outlined. And so you see some overlap here. But one of those things was about measuring impact. How do we get clear about what our challenges are and what are going to be the right data points that we need to measure to demonstrate impact? What we discovered is that a lot of organizations, or some organizations, happen to take an approach where they're looking at what are other companies doing and not really looking back inside to say, what's going to make the most sense for us to move the needle around this subject we call diversity, equity, and inclusion. So identifying what we want to measure and being clear about what we want to try to impact. And then that was the thing that led them to what they would consider to be effective practices around building inclusive cultures. The other one that we looked at is how to stay in tune with what was going on inside of the organization. And we've heard people talk about this in terms of leveraging employee resource groups or building champions or finding other ways for senior leaders or for the organization to keep the pulse on the environment so that people understand what's happening and how our employees might be feeling. This becomes particularly important over the last 12 to 18 months because we see a rise in the initiatives around diversity and inclusion is in large part a response to George Floyd and subsequent Black Lives Matter movement. But what people haven't always unpacked regarding that movement is that now you created almost a fourth category of diversity and inclusion that we need to consider. And this is kind of the social or social impact or racial injustice or social inequality, where communities, customers are actually driving and forcing higher levels of accountability for the organizations. So now I need to share my metrics, even if I didn't have to before, but now we have this large community that is saying it's no longer enough to be verbally supportive of diversity and inclusion efforts. We want to see what you're doing inside of your organization in order to say that you are actually a champion of diversity. It's no longer a lip service type movement. So groups are trying to wrestle with, we got this huge swell of accountability that is external and sometimes conflicting, where some people want you to do it and others do not, and they're trying to find what's the right initiatives that's going to help us move forward. And then the last one, I think, is just really trying to identify what the effective approaches are. And I'm very intentional about using the word effective over best because we hear the term best practice a lot. And what I've discovered is that a lot of organizations get themselves in trouble when they follow best practice. I would actually prefer that you follow effective practices and what is effective for your environment and your organization. So if I was to jump on the point that you'd asked John about what are some kind of specific things that an organization can do to illustrate or demonstrate measurement around diversity and inclusion. Here's an organization, won't say the name, that was very clear about they wanted to increase their marketplace customer growth, customer expansion, really leveraging diversity to help grow the business. Now, all of us have a slide somewhere in our diversity deck that talks about, hey, diversity improves innovation and outcome and customer sales. So how do you measure that? And so what this group was doing is they actually created measures that looked at and talked about what are the new ideas that are created from diverse teams. So they intentionally put diverse teams together and they tried to measure ideas. So one volume they looked at is ideas that were created as an outcome of having a diverse team. And then the ultimate measure was, when does an idea go to market? Because remember, innovation doesn't start when you create an idea. Innovation starts when you go to market. And so now they're looking at how do all of these diverse thoughts or profiles, conversations lead to initiatives that went to market, and what has been the success of that product in the market. You can see this with organizations that create video games, where there was one where they created a new joystick for individuals with disabilities so that they could interact with that. That was an idea generated through diverse groups that actually went to the marketplace. So you start to think about how your business interacts that way.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you, Tony. Second question for the panel, and John, I'm going to go to you on this first. What future issues or questions, for you, John, related to analytics, do you believe companies will need to tackle as they continue to drive and evolve their DE&I agenda?
So to me, it goes back to the key drivers. So we have a lot of data now, right? 10 years ago, companies were struggling just to have data and to think about metrics and dashboards and all that good stuff. Now we have a ton of data. And the question is, what do we do with it? And how do we advance our understanding of what's happening in the workplace? And so to me, again, it goes back to the analytics piece around linking what we're doing with our key HR practice areas. So we know, that the best recruitment and assessment and selection practices can help create a more diverse pool, but if we're not retaining them, we may be at sort of a net negative at the end of the day. So just thinking broadly about the entire cycle and what the drivers are at various phases, I think is the next horizon. It's hard work, it's science, it's not all that, it's not fast. It's not easy. It's complicated and messy. So I think that's what's ahead. So I think, if you have the patience and resources and sort of discipline to think more of like in a many month cycle, there's some real payoff there, right? To getting underneath the surface of what might be happening. So to me, that's sort of what's ahead.
Yeah, if it was easy, we would have made a lot more progress on this sooner with all the focus it's gotten. So, but the time is right, that's for sure. Tony, how about you?
I think what some of the things that we've seen is just what are the methods for improving or increasing leader commitment? And what does that mean and what does that look like? And so I think about it in 4 areas, but one of the areas is increasing leaders' experiences with diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we enhance their experiences that they can engage in? The other one is how do we increase their participation so that they become more visible and they connect more with their employee base, and particular diverse talent employee base, so that people have access for interaction and talking with them. So participation becomes important. Development, it seems to be a lot of companies are doing that well. They're thinking about trainings and all those other things. Oh, we're going to give you unconscious bias training. And then the last area is accountability. And so what are we doing to think about how do we increase their accountability for effectiveness in the space? What are the rewards? What are the systems? What are the things that we have in place? So when they get the right experiences, they have the right participation, they get the right development, then the right accountability, what we see is that leader commitment, leader engagement increases, and the employee's connection or understanding of the leader's commitment to D&I also increases.
You'll be happy to know, Tony, the RA study that they presented earlier tracks well with what you just said too. So.
Nice. All right.
Brad, how about you?
Yeah, I think there's a couple key things as companies continue to look to drive these, conversations. And, the first one really relates to, piece that Tony just highlighted, which is that commitment and participation piece. There's a lot of discussion during the session that, as companies have rolled out, maybe training or workshops around having these conversations, that if they've been voluntary, that, engagement and participation hasn't been quite as high as they would have hoped, right? So what they've done is maybe reverted to requiring them, or maybe a kind of soft mandate, you might call it. And certainly that gets you the participation numbers, but does that really get you the engagement and commitment that you're looking for, right? So I think companies are really looking for, how do we really get employees to do this kind of voluntarily and really get that engagement participation up. The second key, issue that we talked about is, what does this look like when employees come back to the office, right? Because to date, these conversations have been all happening virtually, and there wasn't a real clear consensus on whether, doing them in person will be easier or harder, right? And you can make an argument for both. In some respects, we know that some power distance has been kind of reduced during the pandemic as everybody's kind of been on equal playing field. Managers have adopted a more empathetic approach, which may, open up opportunities for more of these conversations. At the same time, you can imagine, being able to sit down with your employees face to face and have these conversations in person might be, easier in many respects, right? So I think companies are thinking about, do they need to adapt their approaches as employees start coming back to the office? But I think much of that is still kind of fluid until we see exactly what the implications are.
Yeah, Brad, let me just add, because there's nothing more puzzling to me than an organization that comes and they share that, hey, we did a book club, we had a town hall, we got these nice principles, Now what do we do? Right. And so the assumption that we sometimes make is that by knowing more that you will do better. And that doesn't easily translate. And so we really have to be intentional about not just kind of increasing the awareness, but what are the other pillars that you can put in place to help leaders transition so that the behaviors of inclusion become what I call habits. Right? How do you make it a habit versus a practice that you do because Tony invited you to do so? So it's just a really interesting discussion to hear organizations try to describe that feeling of we did it all, but we still don't know what to do, or worse yet, nothing has changed. And so that's where you're chasing after best practices in terms of getting clear about what is it that I need my leaders to do in this space that's going to create this change. And I think when we get really, really good at that diagnosis, that we discover new opportunities for creating environments that value inclusion.
Yeah, and I think that really hits at, another related theme, which is the sustainability issue, right? Is a lot of companies talk about, oh, we really need to embed this in the business. We need to embed this in the functions. I think the question, how do we do that? And what should we be embedding, to your point, right? And where are those opportunities to really make this sustainable going forward?
Tony, you talked a lot about building leadership commitment, engagement, and accountability. What good practices or methods have you seen some companies you've worked with take there?
Yeah, so there's some general things that have seen or we've heard that were working well, and all the way down to creating talking sheets for people leaders. So and asking those leaders to have at minimum, making this up, 4 conversations a year. So you're providing them with the say this, say that, show them our commitment to diversity and inclusion, ask them how they're feeling, take notes, tell them what they're going to do. I mean, it's literally just written out in that kind of detail, which I've seen organizations do in order to try to entice more participation. We also seen organizations attempt to quantify how often senior leaders show up at internal/external events. So if you're a senior leader, did Beth go to an ERG this month? Did you go to 2 of them? And over the course of the year, did you visit so many spaces so that you were present? And so they were really trying to get some of that qualitative data to show up, in addition to the quantitative data that John points to when we start to talk about representation and succession planning and movement and other things. So around participation, we see that, man, I don't know if there's an organization in the US that's not doing unconscious bias training. But one of the things that's interesting about unconscious bias training, which I find fascinating from research, is that they say is that the more you study unconscious bias training, the better you get at recognizing bias in other people. And what we really want is for you to think about what are ways that we can get people to reflect on their own biases. And so we see a lot of asking leaders to share stories, asking leaders to talk about experiences that shape how and why they lead, asking leaders to invite their teams to have these conversations. And this is fascinating because it happens at a high level. I have an all hands-on forum or a senior leader having conversation. But where the real rubber seems to have the greatest impact is where we can get mid-level people, leaders, facilitating those type of conversations with their small teams. And so really trying to influence that. And then last, one experience that I share, I got a lot of favorite ones, but one of my favorite ones is that we took a leadership team to a dining in the dark experience. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but this is an experience where you go and you have dinner in a place that is completely dark, and you get a sense of what a person who might have sight challenges might be experiencing in their day-to-day life. Is something that will seem easy for you, eating dinner. The entire staff in the place are blind, and they can walk around, navigate, and deal with you and interact with you flawlessly. You're sitting at a table, you can't see your hands in front of you. You can't see the food on your plate. And having the C-level leaders have experiences, those type of emotional experiences where they are able to kind of discuss and talk about that, has really went a long way to pulling them to understanding the experience of other people. That's a great example, Tony. Really impactful one, I'm sure, for those that have been through it.
John,
Yeah,
I'm
it
going
was
to throw
for
the
me.
last question to you. We've heard a lot of companies talk about creating their own inclusion index. Can you just talk about what that is and how companies should go about creating one if they haven't?
Sure. So, an index is really just a collection of survey questions that are hand selected and kind of bucketed into that label we call inclusion. So, for companies that are getting started, it might make sense to go with something that's already out there just as a starting point if it seems right, because it is some work to understand what the best way is to define that concept for you, and then to think about writing survey questions and so forth. So I think, as a starting point, it does seem to make sense to kind of build from what's out there already. But then as you get further along, you'll probably see that some of those items or questions don't really make as much sense, maybe for your context or your setting, and you may want to adapt and customize a little bit. So that's kind of what we're seeing there, but definitely a shift from just tracking demographics. And it's certainly getting at more of probably what's really happening in different work groups and for different members of the organization. So I think it's really positive development. I think it's probably the impetus for a lot of the changes that you might make, because you can think about not just the inclusion, but also the practices that both drive it or outcomes of it.
Okay. Great, thank you. Well, we're at time for this part, so I want to thank our panelists for their work in facilitating those working groups and sharing the insights, and also all of you out there that participated in those working groups. We encourage you to go to the CAHRS website and see what we've got coming up there as well. Brad?
Thanks, Beth. And Tony, I'm going to put you on the spot. One last question that just came in. I think we have a minute. We can maybe tackle this. So it said, building out the remarks about unconscious bias education, enrolling leaders and managers to reflect on self and leading conversations. Any recommendations you can make to help shift the delivery from D&I and HR people team to really engaging business leaders in co-owning these efforts?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but one of the things that that we've seen work is to really get business leaders to think about their business product or service, and then have conversations, discussion, dialogues in terms of how bias may be impeding those things. So working with a group that was selling a product or service that had low sales in the southeast portion of the US, which was in a community which was identified as Mexican. One of the things that this business leader did is he took his team to that region and began to walk through and understand how members of that community actually use that product. And what they discovered is the way that the organization was marketing the product and the way the consumer was actually using the product was two different perspectives. And so there was a gap there that was just based on everybody uses our product this way, that they began to uncover and understand. So it's really about that. You see tech companies doing a lot of this, what they call hackathons. There are a lot of products that come as a result of really just trying to say, what are the things about our product or service that we could do different, or how can it serve other communities, and really start to build and think from there.
Great, thanks, Tony.
Yeah.
You're off the hook now. I won't throw any more.
I'm off the hook. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for joining today's session. I certainly want to thank all of our speakers, Beth, Dhara, Ethan, Yolanda, Sarah, John, and Tony, for sharing all of their insights during today's session. I hope that all of you are able to take some key takeaways back to your organization to help evolve your own DE&I agendas. I also just want to highlight quickly that we have 2 upcoming CAHRS events, so we'll close out our programming for the first half of the year. Next Wednesday, we'll be doing a webcast that's focused on how companies are preparing for the post-pandemic work and workplace, again, based on a series of working groups that we've done this semester. And on June 9th, we have a webcast scheduled to look at how 2020 has disrupted and reshaped the HR operating model. So encourage you to attend those sessions or share them with people in your organizations. You can learn more about these events as well as register for them at our website. Also, in the next couple months over the summer, we'll be putting up our programming for the fall. So please do visit our website frequently so you can see our upcoming events that we'll have through the second half of the year. Thanks again for joining us today, and hope to see you at a future CAHRS event. Take care.